So, have you ever had a situation in your life where, um, well, I'm just going to say it, God seemed cruel? Um, where you're looking around and going, God, why are you doing this? What's happening here? Why are you making the decisions about this that you are? Sometimes, of course, we're mistaken. It's not God, it's the enemy, it's circumstance, it's our own stupidity, right? But there are times when God actually does something and we know it's Him because, well, in today's episode, we know it's God because the Bible tells us it's God. Genesis chapter 1, chapter 21 and 22. I know we just skipped over 20 if you're following closely. We'll come back to that, just like we'll come back to chapter 12 in a couple chapters from now. They'll all come together in one story, and trust me, by the time it pays off, it'll be worth waiting for. Um, but there are times when God does things in Scripture, and it just seems like he's mean. He's not, because cruelty is not part of God's character. But from our limited perspective here on Earth, as finite beings who don't have God's perspective, there are things that God does sometimes where I got to tell you, I'm scratching my head and going, I don't understand this. What's going on here? And in today's two chapters, Genesis 21 and 22, are two of those primary stories where I look at it and I'm going, what's God? I trust you. I do. But wow, don't, I can't find answers here that make sense to me. I've heard explanations for both of the stories we're about to go through, but neither of them sit well with me. It's like we're trying to explain it away, and I've never found a satisfactory answer yet. So, um, I'm going to tell you right up front, we're going to be left with some unanswered questions by the end of this lesson today. It just is. There are some things about Scripture that are we're never going to know this side of heaven, and we'll talk a little bit about why that's so. But part of today is going to be getting comfortable with uncomfortable things about God. So today we're going to be talking about what do we do when God seems cruel? Genesis 21 and 22. We just left the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in chapter 19. That was kind of a bit of a sidebar to the main Abraham and Sarah story. But even in that story about Sodom and Gomorrah, one of the angels did tell Abraham that Sarah was going to have a baby within the year from the time they visited. So um, yes, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and all of uh, the issues we talked about around that were the main topic of our last episode. But don't forget that happened in the last episode too. The main storyline here is Abraham and Sarah still have to have this baby, and the baby was promised within the year the last time we visited them in chapter 19. So let's take a look at it now. We're jumping ahead to chapter 20, 21, verse 21. And just so you know, we're going to walk through a lot of this story before the notes on the screen change. So if you're watching this, you can kind of just sit and listen for a while because you're not going to see much change on the screen for a while. Okay. Chapter 21, verse 1. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him, which is what the angel told him he should do. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him. So this is now the first infant born under the covenant, and so he receives the sign of the covenant. Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded him. Verse 5. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter. And Sarah means laughter, remember from last time. And everyone who hears about this will laugh, not at me, but with me. There's a big difference between laughing at and laughing with, isn't there? Verse 7. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children, yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So the story takes this wonderful turn for the better, but not for long. Don't get used to good news when you're reading through the Old Testament because it always turns bad really, really fast, unfortunately. 21:8. The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you. because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and the skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bowshot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert, became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt, which is where his mother, Hagar, was originally from, remember. Now, if you've been going along with us through this story may feel a little bit deja vu to you, right? Like, wait a minute, didn't we see this story already? Hagar ran off with Ishmael. This is very, very similar to Genesis 16, which we saw in episode 17. In that one, there were a couple differences, though. Hagar was chased away when Ishmael was a baby, or she ran away. And here are the two big distinctions between that story in chapter 16 and this story today. First, in this story, she doesn't run away. In the last one, she ran away. She's sent away in this story. And secondly, in the last story, she came back. In this story, she will never come back again. She is out of Abraham's household for good. And finally, and here's the weird part of this, to me at least, God approves of this. In verse 12, God says, listen to whatever Sarah tells you. And he knows that Sarah is about to say, send Hagar and the boy away, send Hagar and Ishmael away. And God tells Abraham, listen to Sarah about this. So this is not a question of does God approve of it? We don't know. We know directly God told Abraham, do what Sarah tells you. And God knows that Sarah is going to tell him to send them away. So when we're studying this, whenever I've heard studies on this, I've heard pastors that tend to center on the fact that she runs away and that God provides, which are central to the story, of course. But every time I read this, I get stuck on this third one. God approves of sending a mother and her son with just a skin of water and a small bit of rations into the desert, which is virtually certain death in that culture. Now, God, of course, knows he's not going to die. God knows he's going to rescue him. God knows that's going to happen. But still, this is a horrifying thing. And I always I look at this and I go, God, you're okay with this? How can you be okay with this? And then it gets worse. So we'll deal with two of them together. Let's tell both difficult stories. That's the first difficult story. At the end of chapter 20, or at the beginning of chapter 22, we'll get to that next. Abraham makes a treaty with the two kings. Actually, Abraham makes a treaty with the two kings at the end of chapter 21. And then we arrive at chapter 22 to one of the most told but hardest to understand stories in all of Scripture, where God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. So God says it's okay if Sarah wants to send Hagar and Ishmael into the desert because I'll rescue them. And then God tells Abraham, I want you to sacrifice your son Isaac. We know, and God knew, that he would be rescued at the last minute, but Abraham and Isaac didn't. So it's going to seem cruel. I'm telling you in advance, this is rough. So let's take a look at it. Let's just read it through. It'll take some time to read it through, but it's an important story to see it all the way through. Chapter 21 of Genesis, starting with verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. So we know right up front, this is a test. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. He describes him in three ways. It's like sticking the dagger in. Four ways. Your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. Like in case we're wondering which one, this is not going to be Ishmael. Ishmael's gone anyway, but right. And go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Here's what Abraham's response is in verse 3. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him two of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him. Yes, monstrously big faith. but also a monstrous situation. And it gets tougher. Verse 4. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." This is one of those little moments where Abraham says, "We will come back." Does that mean because Abraham knows there's going to be a switcheroo here, or is this just him not wanting to tip his hand yet to the servants? We don't know whether this is faith or whether this is not wanting to scare the servants or the boy. We don't know what's happening here yet. Verse 6. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" So we know at this point, Isaac has no clue. I also want to point out, take a look at who's carrying what. Isaac is carrying the wood, but Abraham is carrying the deadly parts of it, the knife and the fire, right? Like there's not going to be a last minute where Isaac is going to realize what's going on and turn the knife on his dad. No, he's keeping the weapons to himself, and he only gives Isaac the wood, right? Verse 8. Abraham answered. There's also a lovely comparison that's made here by Christians that this is similar to as Isaac is carrying the wood on which he will be attempted to be sacrificed, just like Jesus later carried the wood for his cross on which he was sacrificed. And I think there's a wonderful parallel there that we can see. Verse 8. Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Now, one way or another, Abraham knew that to be true. God was either going to provide Isaac, which he had provided to him, or he was going to do the switcheroo. I think at this point it's simply Abraham. Abraham believes he's going to lose his son, but God's going to somehow work his best through this. Middle of verse 8. And the two of them went on together. Verse 9. When they reached the place that God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Now, at this point, I have to ask, wait a minute. God knew already that he loved him. When he says, "Now I know you fear God," we knew that already. God knew that already. The angel may not have, but God certainly did. So this is really not so that God can be sure that Abraham loves him. This is at least a way of Abraham demonstrating his faith and thereby hopefully even strengthening his faith that he was willing to do anything that God told him to do. Verse 13. But again, still just an ugly, awkward, strange thing, right? Verse 13. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. Got to be the moment of greatest relief in Abraham's life before or ever since. No moment will be of greater relief than that for him. Verse 14. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. I know the story. I'm so familiar with it. I've heard it since younger than I can remember. But I'm never okay with the story. I'm just going to tell you. And when you put the two together, one chapter after another, usually we teach them separately. But as I was reading it through for this study, I realized, wow, they happen one right after another. And I look at both of them and I go, how can God be okay with either of these stories? With sending Hagar and Ishmael off in the desert, and with going through the motions of believing he's going to sacrifice his own son, and Isaac believing his dad is going to kill him before stopping this. Like I said before, I've heard answers to this. I've heard theologians talk about this, and I have yet to hear an answer that I'm okay with. So I'm going to give you the best I've got. I'm not happy with this, but it's the best I've got. And this is just going to be one of those where we have to struggle with the text and leave ourselves struggling, perhaps. Three different questions that I will answer in three different ways to give three potential answers to what's going on here. First of all, the cultural question. And the cultural question is this: do we not understand it because their culture was just so different from ours? Like, is it possible that because they lived in a culture that had human sacrifice, where it was not unusual for you to sacrifice your firstborn son to the pagan gods, is it possible that in that culture, what they were doing now, they would have left celebrating the kindness of God who stopped the inevitable rather than what would happen normally in their culture? I've heard the explanation. In that culture, in that pagan culture, the firstborn son quite often would be sacrificed. So there was an expectation, like the neighbors around, oh, they're going to kill the first son. Too bad, he's so old that he's probably not going to have another one. But that's what you got to do. And God steps in and says, I'm gonna show you how different my grace is. That not only am I not going to ask you to sacrifice your son, but I'm actually going to save him from the sacrificial act. I think there may be something in that, um, but it's still tough. And then it still doesn't answer the Hagar and Ishmael thing, although maybe that was a cultural thing too. In their culture, after the quote unquote real son Isaac was born, the son by the slave woman Ishmael, in most of their pagan cultures they would have simply killed Hagar and Ishmael. We don't need them anymore. We've got our real son now. That's how the pagans absolutely would have done it. So a death sentence for Hagar and Ishmael was normal in their culture. So sending them off to the desert to fend for themselves, where God would rescue them, is certainly better than just plain up killing them. It's still not great, but it's better than the culture around them. So the answer to the cultural question is we don't understand the culture. Both of these decisions were better than what would have been expected within their culture. So there's a kindness here that those involved in the circumstance would have understood that we in the 21st century AD just can't see. That's the best I've got for the cultural question. Again, still not comfortable with it, but that's one potential answer to it. The second question is, I'm just going to call it the impression question because I didn't come up with a better name for it. The impression question is this: given how different Jehovah was from the pagan gods, and again, the pagan gods don't actually exist, or they were potentially, embodied demon spirits. Given how different Jehovah was from the pagan gods, were these events needed to make a lasting impression? Like, if God's going to rescue Hagar and Ishmael, why doesn't he just send them off in a nice caravan to a nice place? If God's not going to sacrifice Isaac, why does he put him through this thing of actually, believing he's going to sacrifice Isaac? And the answer to that is, well, look at the impression it's going to leave. Hagar and Ishmael don't just not get killed, but they get rescued by God. And so they see God as their rescuer. And same thing, Isaac and Abraham see God as rescuing Isaac from sacrifice, which would have been a normal thing. And so the fact that you actually walk through these events leaves a stronger and more lasting impression. Um, I guess that's part of it. There's something about that explanation that helps me a little bit. But the part of it that makes me uncomfortable is these aren't parables. They were real people who actually went through this. And it almost feels like an ends justifies the means situation. Yeah, it was cruel, but we had a good end to it. Again, it's not cruel. It seems cruel. Like we see in the title, God seems cruel, but he's not. Um, uh, so that's a little bit of an answer, but still not a great answer, at least not for me. Not for me. And then we get to the third question, and it's what I'm simply going to call the unanswered question. And the unanswered question basically is it's the answer. It's not the question. Here it is. Just because I don't understand God's decisions doesn't mean they aren't right. That's the best I've got. Um, when you take a look at the previous stories in Genesis, almost all of the violence was committed either by sinful people, Cain killing Abel, for instance, or the violence was committed by God, but as a direct consequence to horrifying sin, like Noah's Ark and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So up until now, we've seen God be violent, but it's always been like oh wow, we get why he destroyed Sodom, and wow, do we get why he destroyed the earth under Noah. Take a look at the evil that's going on around, or the violence is committed by a sinful human being like Cain. But in these two instances, the offenses of Hagar and Ishmael, for instance, do not deserve a death penalty. I, you've got a young boy who's got an attitude against his younger half sibling. That's not a death penalty. If so, we got to, most of our kids aren't surviving. In fact, none of them are, right? This is not a death penalty thing. Even Hagar's offense of feeling like she was something special in front of her mistress Sarah. That's not that. It's arrogant. It may be pride, but it's not death penalty worthy. In fact, potentially not even sinful. Just they just had an attitude, is all. And then, and there's no indication that Abraham, Sarah, or Isaac did anything wrong to lead to this potential near sacrifice. So, yes, there has been violence before. Some committed by God, some committed by people. But all of the violence before was attached to something where the violence was measured equally, at least, to the sin. It made sense. This isn't a measured response. And yes, in both situations, the penalty is pulled back and there's a rescue that takes place. So I understand that. Um, but it still leaves me anyway. Maybe you're more settled with it than I am. If so, God bless you. That's great. I just am not. So I have to be honest about my presentation of it. I don't understand God's decisions here. I just don't. Um, but I know they're right because I know God's right. I can't figure out how to make it right in my own brain, but that's okay. I don't have to make it right for it to be right. I know that God is right, even if I can't understand it. And the bottom line is it comes down to trust. You know, I trust God. I trust that He knows my best. And even when I can't see why it's the best way, I trust that it is. Now, some people get mad at me for even asking these questions, let alone with asking them and leaving them unanswered like I'm doing now. Um, but here's the deal: the Bible is filled with people asking unanswered questions. Take a look at the Psalms, for instance, Ecclesiastes, a bunch of the Proverbs, a whole bunch of the narratives where people are talking, where are behaving in particular ways. There's a ton of unanswered questions in the Bible. Do we go to the Bible for answers? Yes, there's a ton of answers in the Bible. But a lot of the time in the Bible, we have to be honest. There are questions that don't have answers, and they leave us with lingering doubts. And you know what? That's okay because, well, let me put it up here. It's okay to have unanswered questions about God. You know, if you're looking at this and thinking, wow, he's a pastor, he's supposed to be some kind of Bible scholar and he doesn't have the answer to this. Yeah, I'm a pastor and maybe I'm some kind of Bible scholar. And I don't have answers to everything. I don't. And I'm not going to pretend to have an answer when I don't. And here's why. If we had all the answers, our answers would be bigger than God and they would become our real God. By definition, God is the greatest being, the greatest power in the universe, above the universe, over the universe, right? He's not in the universe, he created it. And as the greatest possible, imaginable, and beyond our imagining being that there is, he has to be therefore greater than my imagination. He has to be greater than my understanding. He has to be greater than my explanations. He has to be greater than my ability to agree. He has to be greater than all those things. So, in order for God to be God, there have to be massive, for lack of a better word, mysteries. Things that I'm just, I reach to this level of understanding, and God reaches to a level of understanding that goes way out of the frame here, right? And if my understanding is here, if God is here, right? Let's put God here. And if I understand everything about God, that places my understanding at a level above God. And my understanding will always be beneath God. And this gap between my understanding here and God here is where the mystery lies and where the confusion lies and where the frustration lies. And sometimes creates doubt. My lack of understanding of God does not cause me to doubt God. It causes me to doubt my own understanding. And I think that's the difference between faith and lack of faith. Um, I don't have to have all my questions answered to trust God. And I believe that is a stronger statement of faith than having to have all the answers, or even worse, what a lot of pastors and Bible scholars do is they make up an answer because they don't want to appear not to have an answer. And I think that's even more dangerous than thinking you've got one. So anyway, yes, that's messy. No, these stories aren't easy, but they're important. And I think it's an important lesson for us to walk through today, that it's okay for God to be here and my understanding of God to be here. It's okay that I don't get it all. I don't understand it all, that there's this gap. Now, hopefully, as my relationship with Jesus grows and as my understanding of Scripture grows, hopefully my understanding gets closer and closer to God. But it will never fully reach that spot, ever. There will always be a gap where God is greater than my understanding, and that is as it ought to be. So I'm okay with that. I hope you are too. Anyway, next week we're going to see the death of Sarah, and really, this is really the last story out of the life of Abraham, because next week the story is going to shift its center. Even though Abraham is still alive, the center of the story is going to shift from Abraham to Isaac as the primary human character. So that's what we'll be looking at next week. I hope you come back for it. We're going to shift the momentum from Abraham, the adult Abraham, to the adult Isaac, and we got a couple really cool stories coming up. I hope you'll be back for it. See you then.